The silence in the Ishikawa mansion was a physical thing, a weight that settled in the lungs and pressed against the eardrums. It was different from the quiet of a library or the hush of a hospital wing late at night. This silence was curated, enforced. It was the sound of power, so absolute it no longer needed to announce itself. Simone knew this. She'd learned it in the 3 months she'd spent polishing floors that reflected the stern faces of ancestral portraits and dusting surfaces that were already immaculate. She wore the dark blue uniform of the household staff, a color that was supposed to make her disappear into the shadows of the sprawling, modern brutalist estate. And most of the time she did. Except for tonight. Tonight, she was trespassing in the heart of that power, the one room forbidden to all but the master himself, his study. The air smelled of expensive, aging things, cedar from the paneled walls, leather from the 3 monolithic armchairs, the faint, crisp scent of old paper. It was a room built for a king or something more dangerous. Simone sat at the massive mahogany desk, her own small pool of light carved out by a green-shaded banker's lamp. Spread before her was not a ledger of illicit accounts or a map of rival territories, but a textbook thick enough to stop a door, Guyton and Hall's textbook of medical physiology. Her notes, precise and color-coded, filled a spiral notebook beside it. The Krebs cycle swam before her exhausted eyes. She was a ghost in this machine, a 20-year-old nursing student using a Japanese Mafia boss's desk to memorize the intricate dance of cellular respiration. The absurdity was not lost on her, a dry, hysterical humor that lived just beneath the surface of her fatigue. She'd been working doubles all week, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Sato, down with the flu. Her own apartment felt a world away, and the quiet, the sheer, perfect quiet of this room, was a siren's call. Just for an hour, she'd told herself. Just until she understood the sodium-potassium pump. That was 2 hours ago. The soft click of the study door opening was a sound so out of place in the tomb-like silence that her heart forgot its own rhythm. It didn't slam or swing. It simply unlocked and opened with an oiled, deliberate slowness. Simone's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She didn't look up. She couldn't. Her entire world narrowed to the diagram of a nephron on the page, the black ink a meaningless scrawl. Footsteps, unnaturally quiet on the plush Persian rug, stopped just behind her chair. She could feel the heat of a body, the displacement of air. She could smell a faint, clean scent of sandalwood and something metallic, like cold steel. She held her breath, waiting for the explosion, for the hand on her shoulder, for the end of her job, and maybe more. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon in itself. It was a test. She knew it. A long, agonizing minute passed. Then another. Finally, a voice, low and smooth as polished granite, cut through the stillness. "You have been busy." Simone forced her head up, her neck stiff, and turned slowly in the large leather chair. Tatsuya Ishikawa stood there, a specter in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He wasn't as large as she'd imagined a man of his reputation would be, not a brute. His power was in his stillness, in the unnerving calm of his dark eyes. Those eyes were fixed not on her face, but on the open textbook. Threads of silver glittered at his temples, the only sign that he was older than the ageless, severe set of his features suggested. He was the undisputed Oyabun of the Ishikawa-gumi, a man whose name was spoken in whispers in the darkest corners of the city. He was her employer. And she was sitting in his chair, using his lamp, breathing his air. Her mind, usually so quick and clinical, was a blank slate of pure terror. She opened her mouth, but only a dry, clicking sound came out. He made a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand, a command for her to remain seated. He moved around the desk, his movements fluid and economical, and stood on the other side, looking down at her work. His gaze swept over the highlighted passages, the frantic marginalia, the complex diagrams she'd been trying to commit to memory. He didn't look angry. He didn't look anything at all. That was worse. An expressive monster you could understand. You could predict. This man was a black hole, absorbing all light, all emotion, giving nothing back. Pathophysiology, he said. It wasn't a question. He tapped a long, elegant finger on a diagram of the heart. The conduction system. Simone finally found her voice, though it was a thin, reedy thing she barely recognized.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Ishikawa, she mentally cursed herself. Which was it? Sir? Mr. Ishikawa? She was just the maid. She was supposed to be invisible. I am so sorry. I know I shouldn't be in here. The house was just so quiet. And I have an exam. The words tumbled out, clumsy and foolish. Excuses. He would not care for excuses. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and his gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. It stripped away the dark blue uniform, the tired student, the terrified girl, and seemed to assess the very marrow in her bones. You are studying to be a nurse, he stated, his eyes flicking to her worn hospital badge peeking from the pocket of the bag she'd foolishly left by the desk. She could only nod, her throat tight. He was quiet for another long moment, his stillness a stark contrast to the frantic hammering in her chest. She prepared herself for the inevitable, the cold dismissal, the quiet threat, the call to his security to have her removed. He was a mafia boss. His world had no room for trespassers. Instead, he did something that made her blood run colder than any threat could have. He pulled out the chair opposite her, the one reserved for his most trusted advisors or his most terrified enemies, and he sat down. The shift in his posture was minimal, but the change in the room's atmosphere was seismic. He was no longer the master of the house confronting an errant servant. He was something else, something unreadable. From Tatsuya's perspective, the girl, Simone, he recalled from her employment file, was an equation he could not immediately solve. He had returned to his home, his sanctuary, expecting the sterile perfection his staff was paid handsomely to maintain. He had sensed a disruption, a single light burning where none should be. His first thought was of betrayal, an assassin, a rival spy. His hand had been resting on the cool metal of the pistol tucked in his waistband as he opened the door. What he found was not a threat, but an anomaly. A young woman, her dark skin a stark, beautiful contrast to the pale green glow of his lamp, lost in a world of cardiac muscle and renal tubules. He had watched her for a full 2 minutes before he spoke, observing the faint frown of concentration on her face, the way she chewed on the end of her pen, the sheer, unadulterated focus she radiated. It was a quality he recognized. It was the same laser-like intensity he applied to a hostile takeover or the dismantling of an enemy's operation. To see it here, in his study, applied to the study of healing, was a dissonance that intrigued him. Fear was the currency of his world. He saw it every day. He saw it in the eyes of his own men, his partners, his enemies. He saw it in the tremor of the hand of the city councilman who took his bribes. He saw it in the way waiters at his favorite restaurants avoided his gaze. He had expected to see that same, familiar terror in her eyes. And he had, for a moment, but underneath it there was something else, a flicker of defiance, the stubborn refusal to be dismissed as nothing more than a frightened maid. She had answered him. She had explained herself, however clumsily. She had met his gaze. Tatsuya Ishikawa was a man who collected rare things, ancient katana, priceless ceramics, men's loyalties. He was not accustomed to being surprised. Yet this girl, in her simple blue uniform, surrounded by the trappings of his immense and violent power, was the most surprising thing he had encountered in years. He looked at her notes again. They were not the work of a student merely trying to pass. They were the work of someone striving for mastery. The detail was exhaustive, the handwriting neat despite its obvious haste. She wasn't just studying. She was conquering. A flicker of something that might have been respect, or perhaps just profound curiosity, moved through him. He had built an empire on understanding human motivation, greed, fear, ambition, revenge. Her motivation was different. It was clean. It was to understand the mechanics of life itself.
To heal.
In his world, such a thing was a liability, a weakness. But seeing it here, burning so brightly in the quiet solitude of his study, it felt like a strength he had never before considered. He made a decision. It was impulsive, illogical, and utterly unlike him. But the anomaly had to be studied further. He had to see what would happen next. A week passed in a state of suspended animation for Simone. Every creak of a floorboard, every unexpected shadow, sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She expected a summons, a termination letter left on her pillow, a quiet word from Mrs. Sato. Nothing came. The silence from Tatsuya Ishikawa was more unnerving than any reprimand. She went about her duties, her movements quiet and efficient, cleaning the vast, empty rooms of the mansion, her mind a constant loop of fear and confusion. She avoided the wing containing the study as if it were radioactive. She took her breaks in the noisy staff kitchen and buried her face in her textbook, the familiar words a comforting anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Then the summons came. It wasn't a shouted order or a grim-faced bodyguard at her door. It was a note, on thick, cream-colored cardstock, left on her neatly made bed in the staff quarters. My study. 10 p.m. No signature was necessary. The sheer authority of the request was signature enough. Her hands trembled as she held the card. This was it. She spent the rest of the day in a fog, mechanically polishing silver, her thoughts racing. At precisely 10 p.m., she stood before the heavy study door, her knuckles hovering over the wood. She smoothed down her clean, dark blue uniform, took a deep, shaky breath, and knocked. His voice, calm and immediate, bid her to enter. He was seated behind the desk this time, in his rightful place. The banker's lamp cast the same intimate glow, but tonight it illuminated stacks of files and what looked like architectural blueprints. He was working. He watched her approach, his dark eyes unblinking. He gestured to the chair she had occupied a week ago. Sit. Simone sat, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt like a prisoner before a judge. I assume you expected to be dismissed, he said, his voice a low murmur. Yes, sir, she whispered. It was a serious breach of protocol. He almost smiled. It wasn't a real smile, more a slight, terrifying twitch at the corner of his lips. It was. Mrs. Sato is a great believer in protocol. She would have you scrubbing floors with a toothbrush for a month. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. However, the results of your examination are more important than Mrs. Sato's protocols. Simone blinked, confused. My exam. You have it tomorrow, do you not? At 9 a.m. How did he know that? The question must have shown on her face because he added, Your employment file is very thorough. Of course it was. A man like Tatsuya Ishikawa, a powerful mafia boss, would know everything about the people who lived under his roof. He would know her class schedule, her grades, her social security number, the name of her first pet. The thought was deeply unsettling. From tonight, he continued, steepling his fingers, you will use this study every evening from 10 o'clock until midnight. You will not be disturbed. You will have access to the coffee machine in the adjoining pantry. You will inform me directly if any of the staff bothers you. Simone stared at him, utterly speechless. This was not a dismissal. It was an invitation, a command, a professional arrangement that felt profoundly, dangerously personal. Sir, I don't understand. It is not necessary for you to understand, he said, his voice devoid of warmth but also, surprisingly, of menace. It is only necessary for you to comply. The pursuit of mastery is a commendable goal. I do not wish for it to be interrupted by a lack of adequate study space. He slid a thin, black business card across the polished surface of the desk. It had his name, Tatsuya Ishikawa, embossed in silver, and a single phone number. My personal line. Should you require anything.
Books.
Research materials. He looked at her, his expression unreadable.
Now.
If you will excuse me, I have work to attend to. Do not let me distract you. He turned his attention back to his files. The audience concluded. Simone sat frozen for a full minute, the black card feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. She was not fired. She was sponsored by a man who broke bones for a living. The sheer, dizzying absurdity of it all was overwhelming. She looked at her textbook, then at the man across the desk, the most powerful Japanese mafia boss in the city, who had just effectively become her very own, very terrifying, academic advisor. From that night on, A strange, silent ritual began. Tatsuya found himself altering his own schedule, manufacturing reasons to be in his study late into the evening. He would sit behind his desk, immersed in the brutal calculus of his business, shipping routes, territory disputes, betrayals to be managed, while on the other side of the vast room, Simone worked. He never spoke to her. He never looked up. But he was aware of her in a way that defied logic. He was aware of the soft scratch of her pen on paper, the quiet rustle of a turning page, the almost inaudible sigh of frustration when a concept eluded her. These small sounds were an island of calm in the violent ocean of his life. He watched her, not directly, but in the reflections in the dark windows or the polished surface of his desk. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, but also the fierce determination that burned through it.
She was disciplined.
He respected discipline above all else. It was the foundation upon which he had built his empire. To see it manifested in this young woman, in pursuit of knowledge rather than power, was a constant source of quiet fascination. He began leaving things for her. One night, it was an old, leather-bound anatomical atlas from his private collection, its illustrations rendered with breathtaking, artistic detail. He simply left it on the corner of the desk she used. She arrived, saw it, and her hand hovered over it for a long moment before she opened it with a reverence that pleased him. She never mentioned it. He never acknowledged it. It was a conversation held in silence, a transaction without words. Another night, after overhearing a fragment of a phone call where she worried about the cost of a particular pharmacology textbook, he had the book delivered to the house. It was waiting for her on the desk, pristine and new. He watched as she traced the title with her finger, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her serious expression. That smile did something to the cold, hard machinery of his heart. It was like finding a wildflower growing in the cracked concrete of a prison yard. He felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation coil in his gut. It was protective. It was possessive. He, who owned buildings and businesses and men's souls, found himself wanting to own the quiet space she occupied in his study, to protect it from the ugliness of the world, his world. This was a weakness. A profound tactical error. He knew it. A mafia boss could not afford such distractions. And yet, he could not stop. He was the observer, the scientist studying the anomaly. But he was beginning to suspect that the experiment was changing him more than it was changing her. The books became their language. Simone knew they were from him, of course. There was no other explanation. Each one was a carefully chosen breadcrumb, a silent acknowledgement of her struggle and her progress. She never thanked him aloud. The fragile, unspoken truce they had established felt too delicate for words. To speak of it would be to name it, and she had no idea what it was. But a strange sort of comfort grew in the shared silence. The study, once a place of terror, became a sanctuary. The presence of the formidable mafia boss across the room was no longer a threat, but a steady, grounding force. His intense focus seemed to fuel her own. One evening, she arrived to find him not at his desk, but standing by the towering shelves, a heavy book in his hand. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time, he did not immediately look away. "The Emperor of All Maladies," he said, reading the title. "A biography of cancer. You are moving into oncology next semester," she confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart was beating a little too fast. This was new territory. "It's a required reading," he nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the back cover. "A formidable enemy. It wages a war of attrition. It understands strategy." He spoke of the disease as if it were a rival organization, a thing to be analyzed and dismantled. He looked at her, a question in his dark eyes. Why this? Why the body? Why not law or finance? "You have the intellect for it." The question was so direct, so personal. It caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that with such genuine curiosity. "My mother," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "She was a nurse. She died when I was 12. Cancer." She had meant to say it. It was too much, too raw, too vulnerable for this room, for this man. She immediately regretted it, bracing for a platitude or, Worse, an awkward silence. Tatsuya did neither. He simply closed the book with a soft thud and placed it carefully back on the shelf. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the unfeeling Oyabun slipped. She saw something else in his eyes, not pity, but a profound, startling understanding. It was the look of a man who was intimately familiar with loss, who lived with ghosts of his own. "I see," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You're not just studying. You are preparing for a rematch." He walked back to his desk, the conversation over as abruptly as it had begun. But something had irrevocably shifted. He had seen a piece of her, and he had not dismissed it. Simone sat down at her usual spot, but she couldn't focus on her work. She was intensely aware of him, of the quiet rhythm of his breathing, of the charged space between them. The professional arrangement was dissolving, its edges blurring into something frighteningly intimate. A bond was forming, woven from silent understanding and shared solitude, and she was terrified of it. Because a bond with a man like Tatsuya Ishikawa was not a lifeline. It was an anchor, capable of pulling her down into the dark, violent depths where he lived. The night the world shattered, it began with the sound of breaking glass. It wasn't the loud, theatrical crash of a movie. It was a sharp, percussive pop from the far end of the mansion, followed by a series of muffled, ugly thuds. Simone was deep in a chapter on cardiac arrhythmias, her mind a world away. But that sound, so alien in the tomb-like silence of the house, pierced through her concentration. Across the room, Tatsuya was on his feet before the echo had faded. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The quiet, intellectual man who discussed oncology was gone. In his place was the predator, the Mafia boss. His body was coiled with a lethal stillness, his head cocked, listening. He moved to the desk, and with a single, fluid motion, pulled a sleek, black pistol from a hidden compartment. He didn't look at her, but his voice was a low, urgent command. "Get under the desk." Now, Simone didn't hesitate. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded her system. She scrambled out of her chair and curled into the dark space beneath the heavy mahogany desk, pulling her knees to her chest. The study door burst open. Not with a click, but a splintering crash. Two men, dressed in black, masks covering their faces, stormed in. They were armed. Tatsuya didn't flinch. He fired twice. The sounds were deafening in the enclosed space, sharp claps of thunder that vibrated through the floorboards. One of the men crumpled to the ground without a sound. The other grunted, staggering back, but raised his own weapon. Tatsuya was already moving, using the massive desk as cover, his movements impossibly fast and precise. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. He was a creature of pure, controlled violence. Simone pressed her face against the cold wood, her eyes squeezed shut, her hands over her ears. She could hear shouting from the hallway, more gunshots, the sickening, wet sound of impact. She was trapped in the middle of a war. She had been a fool, a naive, stupid girl, to think this sanctuary was safe. This was the reality of his life. This was the price of his quiet sponsorship. Suddenly, Tatsuya was there, his hand gripping her arm. His touch was not gentle, but it was firm, grounding. "Come on. We have to move." He pulled her out from under the desk. His suit was immaculate, but there was a small, dark splash of blood on his white cuff. He didn't seem to notice. His eyes were scanning the room, the hallway, calculating, assessing. He kept his body between her and the open doorway, a human shield. "Stay behind me. Do not make a sound." He moved with her through the study, into the adjoining pantry, and towards a section of wall that she had always assumed was solid. He pressed a spot, and a door swung silently inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. A safe room. The air inside was cool and smelled of concrete and steel. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, plunging them into absolute silence, a silence even deeper and more profound than the one she was used to. The sounds of the battle outside vanished. It was just the two of them. In the dark, the faint scent of gunpowder and blood clinging to him. Inside the sterile confines of the safe room, The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a tremor in its wake. Tatsuya's hand was still on her arm, his grip a brand of heat against her cold skin. A single emergency light flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows on the steel walls. In the dim glow, she could see the tension in his jaw, the hard set of his shoulders. The violence was over for now, but it still lived in him, a coiled serpent beneath the surface. He finally let go of her arm, his movements slow, as if remembering how to be gentle. His eyes, dark and bottomless, searched her face, her arms, her body, checking for injuries she hadn't even registered. He was the one who had just faced down armed intruders, who had killed at least one man right in front of her, yet his immediate, overriding concern was for her. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, strained. She shook her head, unable to speak. Her body was trembling uncontrollably, a delayed reaction to the terror.
He saw it.
He took off his suit jacket, the fabric still warm from his body, and draped it over her shoulders. The scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him enveloped her, a strange comfort in the cold, sterile room. He didn't try to soothe her with empty words. He didn't say it's okay or you're safe now. They both knew that was a lie. She would never be truly safe again. Instead, he simply stood before her, a silent, formidable guardian in the dark. Tatsuya watched the tremors rack her small frame. He had orchestrated and witnessed countless acts of violence in his life. He had seen death, fear, and pain in all its forms. It was the wallpaper of his existence. But seeing her, this brilliant, quiet girl, caught in the crossfire of his war, ignited a fury in him so cold and so absolute it nearly choked him. The intruders had not just breached his home, they had breached her sanctuary. They had threatened the one clean, good thing that had stumbled into his life. He had built walls of steel and concrete, surrounded himself with loyal, armed men, all to protect his empire. He realized now, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that none of it mattered if he could not protect her. The anomaly, the girl who studied medicine at his desk, the carefully constructed compartments of his life, the ruthless Oyabun, the quiet intellectual, the lonely man, had shattered. There was only the man standing in front of Simone, the man who had just realized that the thought of her being harmed was more terrifying than any enemy, more devastating than any betrayal. His entire world, which he had controlled with such ruthless precision, had just contracted to the size of this small steel room, to the presence of the trembling woman wearing his jacket. He had to make a choice. To let her go, to send her away for her own safety, was the logical, honorable thing to do. But the thought of his life, his house, his study, returning to the perfect, sterile silence it had held before she arrived, was unbearable. The silence would no longer be a sign of power. It would be the sound of absence. It would be the sound of loss. He could not let her go, which meant he had to bind her to him, so completely and irrevocably that no one would ever dare to touch her again. He waited until her trembling subsided into a fragile stillness. The silence in the safe room was absolute, a vacuum where the only sound was the frantic beating of Simone's own heart. Tatsuya moved to a small panel on the wall and pressed a button. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a small, impeccably stocked bar. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass and held it out to her. "Whiskey. Drink it." It was a command, not a suggestion. She took the glass, her fingers clumsy, and took a sip. The liquor burned a fiery path down her throat, but it steadied her nerves, chasing away the last of the icy shock. He watched her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "They are gone," he said finally. "My men are cleaning up. The threat is neutralized." Cleaned up. Neutralized. Such sterile, clinical words for the blood and death she had just witnessed. He was not apologizing. He was not explaining. He was stating facts. This was his world, and for one terrifying night, she had been a tourist in it. "This will not happen again," he continued, his voice a low, dangerous promise. "I will burn their entire organization to the ground. I will salt the earth where their houses stood. No one will ever threaten this house or anyone in it again. He looked at her then, and the full, terrifying force of his will seemed to focus on her like a laser. Which brings me to you. Simone's blood ran cold. She thought of her small apartment, her half-finished nursing degree, the simple, normal life she had been working toward. It all seemed like a dream from another lifetime. You cannot go back, he stated, as if reading her mind. They have seen you. They know you are here. They will see you as a weakness. My weakness. To let you leave now would be to sign your death warrant. The words were brutal, a cage of logic snapping shut around her. He was right. She had seen the inside of his world. She was a liability. A loose end. What are you going to do with me? She whispered, the whiskey glass shaking in her hand. Tatsuya took a step closer. The space between them shrank until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, not to touch her, but to take the glass from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. The brief contact sent a jolt through her. When I first saw you, he began, his voice dropping to a near whisper. In my study, surrounded by her books, I saw a discipline, a strength that I recognized. I can only offer you my protection, my name, my world. He met her gaze again, and his eyes were raw, stripped of all artifice. It was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him. I am a Mafia boss, Simone. That will not change. But I am also a man. And that man is asking you to become his wife. The proposal hung in the air, heavier and more dangerous than the scent of gunpowder. It wasn't a question born of love or romance in any traditional sense. It was a strategic move, a binding contract, a declaration of ownership spoken in the language of desperate, brutal sincerity.
Wife.
The word was absurd. He was Tatsuya Ishikawa, a king in a kingdom of violence. She was Simone, the maid, the nursing student. Yet, looking at him now, stripped of his power and revealing the raw, possessive need beneath, the roles felt meaningless. They were just a man and a woman in a steel box, their lives irrevocably tangled by a single night of violence. She thought of her dream, a quiet life, a sterile, well-lit hospital where her job was to heal, to mend, to fight against the chaos of disease with science and compassion. Marrying this man was the antithesis of that dream. It was embracing the chaos. It was walking into the heart of the wound. But as she looked at him, she saw the profound loneliness that clung to him like a second skin. He was a man who commanded an army, but had no one to share a quiet room with. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, but in doing so, had imprisoned himself. She, with her textbooks and her quiet determination, had breached his walls without ever trying. He was offering her a gilded cage, but he was also offering to stand guard at the door himself. He was offering her the only kind of protection he knew how to give. It was a terrifying, complicated, and utterly sincere offer. Could you love someone complicated without losing yourself? Could you find a space for peace inside a storm? Her mother had fought a war inside her own body with quiet courage. Simone realized she was being asked to fight a different kind of war, a war for her own soul, her own identity, within the gilded confines of his world. It was a reckless choice. It was an insane choice. It flew in the face of every instinct for self-preservation she possessed. But her heart, which she had guarded so carefully for so long, was making a different calculation. It was a choice between a safe life of loneliness or a dangerous life of profound, undeniable connection. Okay, she heard herself say. The word was small, a fragile sound in the heavy silence. Tatsuya's carefully controlled expression finally broke. A wave of relief, so profound it was almost pain, washed over his face. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. His touch was no longer just a brand of heat. It was a promise. Okay, he repeated, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It was the sound of a man who had been adrift in a dark ocean and had finally, against all odds, found land. She had not lost herself. She had made a choice. And as she leaned into his touch, the quiet menace of his world still waiting outside the steel door, she felt a fragile, terrifying hope take root in her heart. The storm was not over. It was just beginning. But for the first time, she would not be facing it alone.